Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm always excited when I can talk about some Northern Ag research and the fun things that are hopefully continuing attached to this project. So as a quick sort of overview of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to start with some background, provide a little bit of detail into the original OMAFRA funded project, which has led into this KTT funded project, which includes a toolkit. So I'll highlight some aspects of the toolkit that we worked really hard to share with municipalities and other key stakeholders. I'll talk about what those actual KTT activities were, some of their impacts, and then because our funded time fell through much of the peak of COVID, what our pivot had to be in order to keep moving the project forward and away from sort of the activities that we had envisioned. And then I'll look at some of our lessons learned and some next steps. So the initial study was really looking at the expansion of agriculture in Northern Ontario and how we can increase access to local food. It was sort of funded through a call for health, which looked at an assumption that if we have access to local food, it tends to be fresher food, and in turn, it tends to be healthier. We'd heard pretty anecdotally that there was a lot of expansion into Northern Ontario related to fresh produce, a movement including farmers from Southern Ontario to the north due to things like access to land that was significantly cheaper. And we really wanted to see if this was happening and what that expansion looked like in terms of accessing local food. The outcome of that project was, of course, it was happening. We were intrigued to see how much was going on at the local level, how much of it was fairly informal and really being led by local actors, some local champions, and a little bit to a municipal level. But our toolkit really focused on the municipal piece, recognizing that communities had a role if they wanted to support local food, if they wanted to support the expansion of agriculture. There were some critical pieces that we felt municipalities needed to know, a role they needed to fill, and some knowledge gaps there in particular, because we knew that for some of these municipalities, they didn't really have a history of agriculture in those areas, yet they were very keen to get involved in the local food sector. So trying to identify some of that information for them. The biggest piece then with this toolkit, we had organized it into a number of sections, but there were three that I want to highlight as being quite critical to the research and then the KTT activities that followed. The first was we had identified 10 actions to support local food. And we recognized that with many municipalities in Northern Ontario in particular, access to resources, funding, staff support was likely limited. And there wasn't a lot of sort of extra resources available to go into this new path if it wasn't already something that was identified as a strategy for many rural and northern places. So the action items we identified were all things that we felt were achievable. They, in some instances, required absolutely no additional resources. In other situations, the resource need was quite low. And so we worked really hard to make sure that the things we were recommending could actually be done. There was no point in creating recommendations that were at a political level that was much higher than local municipalities or required significant resources to get them done, because the risk then, of course, was that our toolkit would just sit on a shelf somewhere and it would never be utilized. The other pieces that were included in the toolkit that I think were quite helpful were some key policies as well as stakeholders. So again, we knew that there was likely a knowledge gap for some of the northern municipalities. So we wanted to highlight what some of those policy pieces were that were impacting agriculture or local food. And then as well, who those key people were in the north or agencies or organizations or stakeholders in general that municipalities should be aware of. The last piece was that we really worked hard to profile all of the northern districts. The research itself had fairly limited resources for ourselves, so we weren't able to travel across all of Northern Ontario. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that the toolkit highlighted all of the north. So every district in Northern Ontario is profiled with some sort of success story or innovative action that was done, whether it was at the local level, by municipality, by local stakeholders, or by an individual farmer. The goal was really to make sure that the toolkit itself was inclusive of all of Northern Ontario, recognizing that we unfortunately couldn't get there. So we made sure that for each of those case studies that we profiled, interviews took place with participants from those areas and that they had an actual say in making sure what was profiled was appropriate. So the KTT activities, I would say they were relatively traditional in our approach. Again, our goal was really to make sure that we could profile this research to stakeholders who maybe didn't know the toolkit existed or weren't sure how to utilize it. So the real critical foundational piece, I would say, were the workshops. And again, very traditional in person, trying to make sure that these were occurring in Northern Ontario with the appropriate stakeholders. And so of significance, I would say, is we hosted two fairly large workshops, one in Northeastern Ontario in New Liskeard and one in Northwestern Ontario in Thunder Bay, that were organized by local champions, in particular by OMAFRA staff, which were really helpful in making those connections to the municipal leaders, to the farmers, to the agri-food stakeholders, to whichever organization it may be, making sure that they were invited, they had a place at the table, because there are absolutely tables we sat around. This is pre-COVID, which was ideal for our research. And it meant that we were able to spend a day with folks in the North, take them through the toolkit, and again, those action items in particular, and help to address what we felt were things they could move forward. And as an example, one of the actionable items was identifying your agricultural assets. And this was something that I would say almost every participant felt was easy enough that their municipality could do. They could build their own sort of individual databases of what was where and what did they have. And as part of that, maybe a bit of a gap analysis. And it was something that I would say was taken up fairly quickly. Attached to those workshops, or complementary to those workshops, I should say, we also did a number of presentations, and this was beyond the sort of typical conference presentations, but they also included presentations to different commodity groups, agricultural groups, as well as the Northern Ag Conference that took place in Sudbury in 2020. And I think what's really important about, in particular, that ag conference is it was utilizing a network that had already created a workshop or a conference. They had the stakeholders there. They had all these key people that I wouldn't have had access to ordinarily, and they all came in for this in-person conference. And it was a good opportunity to be there, to share the research, to talk about the toolkit, and make sure that the stakeholders knew it existed. Critical, I think, to most of the things we did for this project is we had actually printed copies of the toolkit. So we had a student design it, which was fantastic. We had them professionally printed, and we brought them with us to every workshop, to every presentation. Every visit to the North included having a backpack full of these toolkits. So it also meant that any municipality I stopped in, I left a few of those there. Any farmer I spoke with, potentially left those with them as well, and any other ag stakeholder. And what was really interesting, and what came out of that presentation at the conference in Sudbury, was a student who's actually doing a co-op with one of the municipalities who participated in one of the fall workshops. And they had the toolkit, and they had sort of marked up all these pages and written all these notes in there, and said that their entire position was about moving our toolkit forward. So it was really impressive to see a municipality that attended a workshop, took advantage of that toolkit, hired a student in particular, which I thought was really valuable for firsthand knowledge mobilization and being able to build a resume, and moving the toolkit forward because they saw the value in that toolkit. And again, in those deliverables and action items that were very much manageable. So it was great to see this uptake by municipalities, and also interest from groups outside of the municipal sector. So farmers were very interested in this, other ag groups were interested in it, producer and commodity groups, of course, and then everyday citizens who had heard about the project. We built a little bit of media profile around it, which was always helpful. And it was great just to see the interest in the research. We had a number of research activities planned for spring and summer 2020 that would have been in person. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and we really had to come up with a sort of project pivot and figure out what we were going to do to keep moving the project forward, to keep providing opportunities for graduate students in particular, and to make sure that the profile wasn't lost. And I think this is where it gets really, the key piece gets back to having a really, really well-developed network and stakeholders who are aware of the project. In about, I'll say April 2020, a colleague who was in the North, knew about the research, had reached out and noted that there was a social media group that was created almost overnight as a result of the pandemic and concerns of food supply disruptions and access to local food. And they were working on building a sort of database of local producers in the North. Thought I might be interested, and connected me with this group that at the time I think had maybe 300 members. And in working with the Facebook group, which now has well over 6,000 members, there was an interest to build a database of Northern producers and help to sort of recognize that there is local food in the North. There are ways to facilitate it. And in building that knowledge is one, I think, critical way to really support the farm sector. And so we were able to pivot our goal of workshops and things with this group and work with two graduate students who worked really hard to map the entire database that this very informal social media group had created created. All of the data in it was voluntary. We utilized ArcGIS, so it's fully searchable. We had an incredible number of partners that arose as a result of this work, and lots of media attention around it. And we were able, through partnership with Collage Boreal, to make sure that the entire map is bilingual, which I think is really important given our Northern Ontario context. Of importance, it does look like there's a lot happening in Northeastern Ontario, and of course there is, but I think it's a little bit misleading in that the project started in Northeastern Ontario right around Sudbury, which is where we see a lot of the pinpoints. There is a lot of stuff happening in Northwestern Ontario. So one of our next sort of steps is to continue to build the profile of this map and make sure we're profiling more of the things that are happening in Northwestern Ontario, because there is a lot of ag capacity happening there, and of course interest in local food as well. But for us, one of the critical things, of course, was pivoting to make sure this project could keep going and figuring out where we could utilize our skills. So a few quick lessons really quickly for us. The tangible resource, I think, was critical. That physical toolkit was so helpful. And again, having a student design it was fantastic. It gave them great experience. They were able to utilize a skill that they really enjoyed. And it meant we were able to put it into people's hands and they could hold it. It's really easy to ignore a PDF. It's really easy to ignore a link to a website. It's a little bit harder to ignore something that's sitting on a table right in front of you. Identifying value and need was also really important, and being able to pivot attached to that. We saw that where we thought the need was going to be in workshops, in fact, it was in building just a database, a simple database around local food, which definitely took some incredible skill and resources, but it was sort of a perfect storm for us. We were available, we had the resources, and we had the knowledge, and that flexibility demonstrated incredible value. And again, lots of media attention as a result of it. The third lesson there is about Northern Champions. We were incredibly lucky to have some fantastic people who were willing to assist, who are willing to bring people together and enhance our network, and as well as make those connections between networks and people we didn't know previously. A few sort of next steps for us. We've updated the toolkit to make sure that it is relevant and the data is up to date. Continuing to utilize social media for the next year or so and try to build some more momentum, especially around that map. And then just maintain interest in the project. The funded KTT project has passed. It was up in September, but I think there's lots of work that can still be done that doesn't necessarily require those financial resources. So really quick overview, a quick note of our project team, which included Dr. Wayne Caldwell and two students, Vanessa and Kaylee, that worked really hard with the mapping piece. A link to our website, Northern On to Ag, there at the bottom, and then my email as well. So thanks, everyone.